My dad kicked me out to give my room to my brother, but when he stole $50,000 from the company and they begged me to help, I exposed them both, and now they work minimum wage jobs while I thrive. I'm 18 years old, just finished high school, and honestly, I need to tell this story because what happened in the last few months basically showed me that sometimes life does deliver justice, even if in the most twisted ways possible. My dad, Kenneth, literally threw me out on the street to give my room to my half-brother Derek and his family, and now, months later, they're desperately begging me to help them cover up a massive fraud that Derek committed at my dad's workplace. You know, the audacity of these people has no limits, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me start from the beginning, when everything was more or less normal, or what I thought was normal at the time. My mom, Amanda, died when I was like 12 years old. It was cancer, one of those that advances super fast and doesn't give you time to even process it. She was the most incredible person I ever met, worked at a tech company and had this super close circle of friends, including Gabriel, who was the CEO of the company, where she worked. My dad met her when she already had Derek from a previous marriage. Derek was like 6 years older than me, and from the beginning it was clear that my dad adored him in an almost obsessive way. I guess my dad always wanted an older son. I don't know. But Derek was his golden boy, his perfect firstborn who never did anything wrong, while I was basically invisible unless he needed to yell at me about something. Looking back, I should have seen it coming. All the signs were there for as long as I can remember. After my mom died, things got pretty bad. My dad became more distant with me, like we only talked when it was absolutely necessary, and Derek had already left the house years ago, living his adult life somewhere else. I basically grew up alone in that house, cooking my own meals, doing my laundry, doing everything while my dad worked all the time or spent his time watching TV in his room. He wasn't the worst father in the world. He gave me a roof and food, but emotionally he was completely absent. You know what I mean? Like he fulfilled the bare legal minimum to be considered a father, but nothing more. My maternal grandparents, Evelyn and Bernard, were the ones who really cared about me. They called me every week, invited me to their house often, made sure I was okay. They lived like an hour away, had this beautiful house with a giant garden, and they always told me their door was open for me whenever I wanted. Things reached their lowest point like 8 months ago. I was in my senior year of high school, applying to colleges, stressed about final exams and all that typical stuff when you're about to graduate. One night, like a random Tuesday in March, I think, I came home after studying at the library, and my dad was sitting in the living room with this weird expression on his face, like between excited and nervous. He told me he needed to talk to me about something important, and I thought, I don't know, maybe he finally wants to ask me how school's going or something, have one of those father-son conversations we never had. I sat down and he dropped the bomb without any preamble. Derek and his family were moving back into the house because they were going through financial problems and needed a place to stay while they recovered. I just went blank for a second, processing the information. Derek had married this girl, Samantha, like 3 years ago, and they had a baby, Lucas, who at that point was like 2 years old. Samantha was one of those influencer moms, always posting perfect pictures of her life on Instagram, making everything look aesthetic and wonderful. But apparently she flat out refused to get a real job because she was convinced her influencer career was going to take off any moment. Derek worked at my dad's company. Gabriel had given him the job as a favor to my mom's memory, and supposedly he made decent money. But with Samantha spending money like they were printing it in the basement, well, obviously they had problems. I asked my dad where exactly Derek, Samantha, and Lucas were going to sleep, and he looked at me with that face he made when he was about to tell me something he knew I wasn't going to like, and said, well, they're going to need your room because they need space for the baby and all their stuff. You can sleep on the couch in the living room for a while. I couldn't believe it. I literally couldn't process what I was hearing. I told him I was in my senior year of high school, that I needed a quiet place to study, that I had important exams coming up, that I was applying to colleges, and he just shrugged and said, I'd have to adapt because family comes first, and Derek needed him. The irony of that statement hit me like a truck, Family comes first, but apparently I didn't count as important enough family to keep my own room. I tried to reason with him, suggested that maybe Derek and his family could use the living room or that we could find another solution. But my dad got more and more irritated and finally exploded, yelling at me that I was ungrateful, that he had given me everything for years, and that the least I could do was help my brother in his time of need. That night, I went to my room, closed the door, and basically had a silent breakdown. I called my grandparents crying, told them everything, and they were furious but also worried about me. My grandma Evelyn told me I could go live with them whenever I wanted, that they had a guest room that was practically mine, but I didn't want to leave school in the middle of the year. All my friends were there, my life was there. And stupidly I thought maybe things wouldn't be so bad, that maybe my dad would reconsider, or that Derek and Samantha would find their own place quickly. Spoiler alert, I was completely wrong, and things were infinitely worse than I imagined. Derek and his family moved in like a week later, and it was absolute chaos from minute one. Samantha arrived with literally 20 suitcases, boxes of shoes, photography equipment for her Instagram posts, baby toys everywhere, and they basically took possession of the entire house like they owned it. My room, which had been my personal space for years, was completely transformed in a matter of days. They removed all my posters, painted the walls a horrible pastel color, put in a giant crib, a changing table, shelves full of baby products, and threw all my stuff in boxes that they dumped in the garage without any care. When I protested, my dad told me to stop being dramatic, that it was just temporary, and that my stuff was safe in the garage. But I knew that many of those boxes had important things to me. Memories of my mom, school projects, my clothes, all mixed up and treated like trash, basically. Sleeping on the living room couch was an absolute nightmare, and I'm not exaggerating. Lucas was a normal 2-year-old kid, which means he woke up crying like 3 times a night. And, since the room that used to be mine was right next to the living room, I heard every scream, every cry, every time Samantha got up shuffling her feet to take care of him. Plus, since the living room was a common area, I had no privacy whatsoever. My dad got up super early to go to work and turned on all the lights. Derek came downstairs at 6 in the morning to make coffee, making an incredible noise. Samantha sat up on the couch at 8 to record her Instagram videos and asked me to move because I was in her camera frame. I couldn't study. I couldn't sleep well. I couldn't have a single moment of peace, and when I complained, everyone told me I was being selfish and that I needed to be more understanding of Derek's situation. What really finished convincing me that I needed to leave was when I started noticing how my dad treated Derek versus how he treated me. Derek didn't work. He literally stayed home all day playing video games or helping Samantha with her posts. Nothing. My dad gave Derek money for gas, for food, for whatever he needed, without ever questioning it. One day I came home from school, starving, and there was nothing in the fridge, and when I asked my dad if he could buy some food, he told me to look for a part-time job if I needed extra money. But Derek, who was 24 years old and perfectly capable of working, received everything for free without doing absolutely anything to earn it. Samantha didn't contribute anything either. In fact, she spent the money my dad gave Derek on expensive clothes and beauty products for her photos, while I had to wear the same 3 outfits all the time because my clothes were buried in some box in the garage. The straw that broke the camel's back came like 2 months after they moved in. It was a Friday night. I had come home late from a group project at a friend's house, like 11 at night. And when I entered the house, I found my dad waiting for me in the living room with his arms crossed and that angry expression that made my nerves stand on edge. He asked me where I had been. I explained that I was working on a super important final project, and he cut me off saying he had already made a decision and that I needed to pack my things because I was going to have to leave the house. I froze. I literally felt like I had been punched in the stomach, and I asked him what he was saying, if he was joking. He said he wasn't joking at all, that Derek and Samantha needed more space because they were considering having another baby, and that Samantha was pregnant again. Well, it turned out that was a lie, but at the time, I didn't know that, and that I was already 18 years old, so legally, I was an adult and could manage on my own. I tried to reason with him, reminded him that I was still in high school, that I had like 2 months left until graduation, that I had nowhere to go, that this was going to completely ruin my future. But he just kept repeating that it was time for me to learn to be independent and that Derek needed his support more than I did. I asked him if he was really choosing Derek over his own son. And he got even angrier and said that Derek was his son too, that in fact he was his first son and that he would always be there for him no matter what, and that I needed to grow up and stop being a child. I told him I had no money, that I didn't have a car, that I literally had no way to get a place to live overnight, and he pulled out his phone and threatened to call the police if I didn't start packing my things immediately. I couldn't believe that my own father was threatening to call the police on me like I was an intruder in my own house. But there he was, dialing the numbers and looking at me with that cold expression that made me realize he really didn't care what happened to me. I went up to the garage, shaking. I don't know if from rage or fear or pure disbelief, and started searching through the boxes, trying to find my most important stuff. I found some clothes, my school documents, my laptop that miraculously was still intact, some photos of my mom that I kept like gold, and I stuffed it all in a big backpack and 2 plastic bags because I didn't even have a decent suitcase. Derek and Samantha were in the room, in my room, and I could hear them laughing at something on TV, completely oblivious or simply not caring that I was being kicked out of my own house because of them. I went downstairs with my stuff and my dad was still there, looking at me like I was committing some kind of personal offense by not leaving faster, and when I got to the door he told me to leave the house keys on the table. I gave him the keys, looked him in the eyes hoping to see something. I don't know. Maybe a glimpse of guilt or regret, but there was nothing there except impatience and annoyance. I left that house at almost midnight with 3 bags of my belongings and absolutely no plan of what to do. I walked to the corner because I didn't want my dad to see me break down right there in front of the house. And once I was out of sight, I sat on the curb and called my grandparents, crying hysterically. I couldn't even speak properly, just sobbed on the phone while my grandma tried to understand what was happening. And when I finally managed to explain that my dad had kicked me out of the house, she yelled at my grandpa to grab the car keys because they were coming for me immediately. They told me to stay where I was, not to move, that they'd arrive in less than an hour. That hour was the longest of my life, sitting on a dark curb with all my possessions in garbage bags, basically. Cars passing by and some people looking at me weird. And I just kept thinking about how I had gotten to this point, how my life had fallen apart so completely in a matter of 2 months. My grandparents arrived, and my grandma practically ran out of the car to hug me, crying herself too, telling me that everything was going to be okay, that they would take care of me, that I never should have gone through that. My grandpa Bernard was furious. I could see how he gripped the steering wheel with his hands while we drove to their house, muttering things about Kenneth and how Amanda would be rolling in her grave if she knew what her husband had just done to her son. When we got to their house, like it was already about 1 a.m, they took me straight to the guest room they had prepared for me. It wasn't just an empty room. They had put clean sheets, had organized the closet, had left towels in the connected bathroom. There were even some snacks on the nightstand next to the bed. My grandma told me that was my room now, that I could stay as long as I needed, that they were going to make sure I finished high school and went to college like my mom would have wanted. That night I didn't sleep at all. I stayed awake, staring at the ceiling, processing everything that had happened. Part of me still couldn't believe my dad had really kicked me out of the house. Like I expected that at any moment my phone would ring with him, apologizing and telling me to come back. But that call never came. The next day, my grandparents helped me transfer to a high school closer to their house for the last 2 months of the school year, which was horrible because I had to start from scratch socially and adapt to a new system just when I was about to graduate. But at least I had a roof over my head and people who really cared about me. Gabriel, my mom's friend, who was the CEO of the company where both my dad and Derek worked, found out what had happened through my grandparents and called me personally to tell me that if I needed anything, absolutely anything, he was there for me because my mom had been like his sister and he considered me practically his nephew. The next few months were weird, like living in a parallel reality where I finally had stability and emotional support, but at the same time was processing all this trauma and betrayal from my dad. I graduated from high school without my dad showing up to the ceremony, obviously, and started applying to colleges with the help of my grandparents, who helped me with all the application costs. Gabriel even offered to write a recommendation letter based on what my mom had told him about me over the years and the few times we had seen each other at family events. My life was starting to take shape again, slowly but surely, and honestly, I had reached a point where I didn't think about my dad or Derek as much as before. I blocked my dad's number because he kept sending me occasional messages asking me to be reasonable and come back home, as if he hadn't literally threatened to call the police to kick me out. Everything was relatively quiet until my Aunt Sharon, my dad's sister, who's always been kind of gossipy but good-hearted, called me one day in late September with juicy news. She kept me updated on what was happening at my dad's house because she was still in contact with him, even though she completely disapproved of what he had done to me. She told me that the situation at the house was an absolute mess, that Samantha and Derek fought constantly about money, that my dad was spending savings he had kept for years to keep them afloat, that Derek wasn't even going to work regularly, and that Gabriel was increasingly annoyed with his performance. Sharon also mentioned that there was no second baby on the way, that it had been a lie Samantha invented to get more space, and that when the truth came out, my dad still did nothing about it. Hearing all this gave me a bitter satisfaction. I'm not going to lie, like part of me was glad that things weren't working out as they had planned. But the real bomb exploded like 2 weeks after that call from Sharon. My dad called me from an unknown number, probably because I had blocked his personal number. And when I answered because I thought it was from the university or something important, he started talking to me, super fast and desperately. He needed a giant favor. Derek was in trouble, serious trouble, and they needed me to talk to Gabriel because Gabriel wasn't listening to anyone else, and maybe if I intervened, things could be fixed. I asked him what he was talking about, and he didn't want to give me details over the phone. Just insisted that we needed to meet in person, that it was urgent, that the family needed to be united at that moment. The audacity of that man to talk to me about family after literally throwing me out on the street months earlier left me speechless for a second. But I recovered quickly and told him it was no longer my problem and that I had no interest in helping them with anything. He started to beg, literally beg, saying that Derek had made a mistake, that he was young and stupid, that he needed his younger brother to be there for him. I hung up the phone without saying anything else and blocked him too. I called Gabriel that same afternoon to ask him what the hell was going on, and he sighed heavily before telling me the whole story. Turns out Derek had been stealing money from the company accounts for months. They weren't small amounts either. We're talking thousands of dollars that he diverted to personal accounts using his access to the financial system. Gabriel had discovered the irregularities during a routine audit, and when he confronted Derek, he tried to deny it at first, but eventually confessed everything, crying and begging him not to report him to the authorities. My dad, who worked in the same department, technically had responsibility for supervising Derek and reviewing his transactions, but obviously he never did, because he blindly trusted his perfect son. Gabriel told me he was incredibly disappointed because he had given Derek that job as a favor to my mom's memory, and Derek had basically spat on that generosity by stealing from the company. He asked me if I knew anything about this, and I assured him I hadn't talked to Derek or my dad in months, that I had absolutely no information and no desire to get involved in that mess. But my dad and Derek weren't going to give up so easily. Like 2 days later, my dad showed up at my grandparents' house with Derek at his side, banging on the door like maniacs. My grandpa Bernard opened the door and told them to get off his property immediately, but my dad started yelling my name, saying he needed to talk to me, that it was life or death, that please come out just 5 minutes. I went out, not because I wanted to help them, but because I wanted to tell them to their faces to go to hell, and what I saw was pathetic. Derek had red eyes like he'd been crying. My dad looked 10 years older than I remembered. Both looked desperate and broken. My dad started with this whole story about how Derek had made a terrible mistake, but that everyone deserves a second chance, that they needed me to talk to Gabriel and tell him that Derek had been under a lot of stress and wasn't thinking clearly. That if I vouched for his character, Gabriel might reconsider not filing criminal charges. I told them they were completely crazy if they thought I was going to lie to Gabriel for them, that Derek had committed fraud and deserved to face the consequences, that my dad should have supervised his employee better instead of being so busy being his indulgent daddy. Derek exploded and started yelling at me that I had always been jealous of him, that my mom would probably be ashamed of my attitude, and that was crossing a line I didn't know I had until that moment. I got close to him and told him exactly what I thought, that he was a pathetic thief who had wasted every opportunity he was given, that he had used and abused Gabriel's and my dad's generosity, that Samantha and he were a pair of parasites who contributed nothing to society except fake Instagram posts, pretending to have a life they could never afford. Honestly, I told him my mom would be horrified to know that her firstborn had grown up to be a criminal who drags the whole family into the mud. My dad tried to calm the situation, but I was already on fire. I told him everything I had kept inside for months. I told him he was the worst father I knew, that he had emotionally abandoned me after my mom's death, that he had chosen Derek over me again and again without any valid reason, that he had kicked me out of my own house when I needed him most, just to please his favorite son. I told him that Gabriel had been more of a father to me in recent months than he had been in my entire life, that my grandparents had done more for me in a few months than he had in 18 years, that I never wanted to see him again in my life, and that they could both go straight to hell. My grandpa came out and told them that if they didn't leave in the next 30 seconds, he was going to call the police for trespassing, and they finally left, but not before my dad yelling that I was going to regret this. That family is forever, and that someday I was going to need them, and they weren't going to be there. After that encounter, I blocked all the numbers I had related to them, blocked their social media, basically erased them from my digital existence. But my dad is persistent when he wants to be. He started calling from other people's numbers, work numbers, unknown numbers, leaving long voicemails where he alternated between begging and threatening. In one, he said that if I really wanted to, I could make Gabriel drop the charges, that I had the power to save Derek but was being selfish. In another, he said that I had destroyed the family and that I would have to live with that guilt my whole life. Gabriel found out about the harassment because I had sent him screenshots of some messages, and he was furious. He told me he was going to have a very serious conversation with Kenneth about the harassment, and that if he didn't stop immediately, he was going to take legal action, not only for Derek's fraud, but also for Derek's fraud. The harassment towards me. Gabriel kept his word, and apparently had a meeting with my dad, where he basically told him that if he contacted me one more time, if he showed up at my grandparents' house again, if he did anything that bothered me, he would personally make sure the criminal charges against Derek were prosecuted with the maximum possible severity, and that he would also file harassment charges against my dad. That finally calmed them down a bit. But the saga still wasn't over because a few days later, my Aunt Sharon called me with even juicier information. Turns out that during the investigation into Derek's fraud, they discovered that he had also been using the corporate credit card for personal purchases. We're talking designer clothes, dinners at expensive restaurants, even a PlayStation 5 and like 3 games, all charged to the company and justified with fake receipts or categorized as business expenses when they clearly weren't. At that point, it wasn't just negligence or a stupid mistake. It was systematic and premeditated fraud, and Gabriel had no choice but to escalate the matter to his legal team. I told all this to my grandparents, and my grandma was torn between being satisfied that Derek was finally facing consequences and being sad because technically he was still family, but my grandpa was completely on the side that they deserved everything that was happening to them. I personally felt a mix of emotions, mostly satisfaction if I'm honest, but there was also a small part of me that felt something weird. Not exactly pity, but like sadness about how everything had ended so badly for everyone, you know? But that small part was quickly crushed every time I remembered how they treated me, how they kicked me out without thinking twice. I decided that if I was going to be involved in this situation in any way, I was going to make sure Derek faced absolutely all possible consequences. I started investigating on my own, checking social media, talking to people who knew them, basically collecting evidence of the ridiculous lifestyle that Derek and Samantha had been living while stealing money. I found posts by Samantha on Instagram where she showed designer clothes, bags that cost thousands of dollars, meals at exclusive restaurants, all time-stamped during the exact months when Derek was committing fraud. I saved screenshots of everything, organized the dates to match the fraudulent transactions that Gabriel had shared with me confidentially, and basically built an airtight case that showed exactly what the stolen money had been spent on. I sent all this information to Gabriel, and he was impressed. He told me I had done the work of a professional investigator and that this evidence would definitely strengthen the legal case against Derek. But I didn't stop there. I also sent an anonymous email to Samantha with all the evidence, explaining to her exactly what Derek had done and how her lifestyle funded by fraud was about to collapse completely. I told her that if she had any intelligence, she'd grab Lucas and get out before everything exploded, and she ended up dragged into the scandal too. I don't know exactly what effect my email had, but according to Sharon, Samantha packed her things and went to her parents' house with Lucas like a week later, left Derek, and basically admitted she didn't want to be associated with a criminal. Derek became a social pariah after that. His friends found out what he had done because I maybe accidentally sent anonymous information to some people in his social circle. You know, just to make sure everyone knew exactly what kind of person he was. His reputation was destroyed. People started cutting contact with him. His social media posts that used to get hundreds of likes suddenly had zero interaction. And according to Sharon, he spent most of his time locked in that room that used to be mine, playing video games and feeling sorry for himself while waiting for the legal case against him to be resolved. Gabriel finally filed formal criminal charges against Derek, and also against my dad for negligence in his supervisory responsibilities, although my dad's charges were less severe. The case went to court and Derek basically had no defense. All the evidence was there clear as day. His own transactions, the fake receipts, the personal purchases, the screenshots from social media showing the stolen products. He was found guilty of fraud and embezzlement. They gave him probation because it was his first offense, but with the condition that he had to pay full restitution to the company, which basically meant he was going to be in debt for years. And plus he was left with a criminal record that was going to make it almost impossible for him to get another decent job. My dad lost his job too. Gabriel fired him for incompetence and lack of proper supervision, although he decided not to prosecute the criminal charges against him with full force, because technically, my dad hadn't stolen directly, he had only failed to prevent Derek's theft. My dad's downfall was almost as satisfying as Derek's. He lost his job after like 20 years at the company. His reputation in the industry was ruined because people talk and everyone found out what had happened. He had to sell the house because he could no longer pay the mortgage without his salary, and according to Sharon, he ended up renting a small apartment in a not very good neighborhood. Derek went to live with him after Samantha left him because he literally had nowhere else to go. So now the two of them are stuck together in a tiny apartment, probably blaming each other for how everything went wrong and not admitting it was their own greed and narcissism that led them to that point. The really ironic part of this whole story is that while their lives were falling apart, mine was improving exponentially. Gabriel offered me a paid internship at his company for the summer, working in the technology department where my mom used to work. He told me he had been impressed with my maturity and how I handled the whole situation, that I clearly had inherited my mom's intelligence and character, and that he wanted to give me opportunities that Derek had wasted. The internship paid incredibly well for my first real job, and Gabriel also told me that if my performance was good, there was a possibility he would help me with college tuition through a scholarship program his company offered. My grandparents were incredibly proud of me. My grandma cried every time we talked about the future and how things were finally aligning. They had helped me apply to several universities, and I received acceptances from some really good ones. I was planning to study something related to technology or business. I still wasn't completely sure, but I had options, which was more than I thought I would have months ago when I was sleeping on a couch. Gabriel wrote me incredible recommendation letters for universities. My grandparents were helping me financially, and for the first time in a long time, I felt like I had a bright future ahead, instead of just surviving day to day. My dad tried to contact me one last time like a month ago, sent a physical letter to my grandparents' house because he no longer had a way to reach me digitally. The letter was long and dramatic, basically saying he regretted how things had turned out, that he never wanted us to get to this point, that Derek was destroyed, and that the family was broken. But not once in that 4-page letter did he admit he had done anything wrong. Not a single real apology for kicking me out of the house, for choosing Derek over me constantly, for treating me like I was invisible for years. It was all about how they were the victims, how I had been cruel not to help them, how the situation was unfair to them. I read the letter once, laughed bitterly, and threw it in the trash without responding. My grandpa asked me if I wanted to keep it for any reason, and I told him no. That part of my life was closed, and I had no interest in keeping memories of people who treated me like garbage. Now I'm here, about to start college in a few months, working at my summer internship, which is being an incredible experience, living with my grandparents who treat me like the grandson they always wanted to spoil, and honestly, feeling happier and more stable than I've felt in years. I'm not going to pretend there aren't difficult days. Sometimes I think about my mom and how things would have been different if she were still here. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done things differently with my dad, although rationally I know I had no other options. But overall, I feel like I got out of a toxic situation that was drowning me and found people who really care about me and want to see me succeed. The last update I got from Sharon was like 2 weeks ago. She told me that Derek finally got a job at a fast food place because literally no one else would hire him with his criminal record, and that my dad is working at a warehouse doing manual labor because he can't get anything in his previous field either. She asked me if I would ever consider reconciling with them, and I told her honestly that no, that they made their choices and now they have to live with the consequences, just like I had to live with the consequences of their actions when they kicked me out without any consideration. I don't feel guilty for not helping them. I don't feel sorry for their current situation. I basically don't feel anything except maybe a bit of satisfaction that karma really exists and eventually catches up with people who deserve it. I guess the moral of this whole story, if there is one, is that eventually actions have consequences, and that people who treat you badly when you're vulnerable don't deserve your loyalty when they finally have the chance to see you prosper. My dad and Derek had every opportunity in the world to treat me well, to be a real family, to support me when I needed it, and they actively chose to do the opposite. So, when the tables turned and they were the ones who needed help, I had absolutely no moral or emotional obligation to be there for them. Sometimes the best revenge isn't doing something active against the people who hurt you, but simply living well and letting them sink on their own with the consequences of their own terrible decisions.